On Anything Goes today, we have Peter Anger has joined us, and Peter is a local artist. He is a member of the KOPN Board of Directors, and he has put together a paper on electricity. And now there's an interesting subject, and Peter, why don't you tell us something about yourself and maybe give us an idea why you are here with us today and what is relevant about this paper you put together on electricity, and what are you going to try to tell us about?
Well, that's what's so exciting about it, is that I've been meditating on the subject of electricity for quite some time, since my father's death in 2005. But I've been a local artist most of my life. I have done commercial photography to support my artistic photographic habit. I've been very much a community activist in the arts, in that Patrick Overton calls me the connector. What I'm really good at is not really matchmaking, but trying to bring people together who need to know each other. And I also do a lot of fine art work and exhibit it both locally and nationally and internationally. But something's been bugging me about one of the fundamental problems we have in the world right now. And it was quite clear after a good discussion with my father back in 2005 that probably the most significant discovery that we've made since fire is electricity. And the story and the relevance of it is really important. You know, I came from a real scientific community and family of friends, but I chose to be an artist. But I feel like it's important to do this interview for a lot of very complicated reasons, but, you know, we'll see where this goes.
Well, it's interesting that you're an artist and that you're kind of drawn to, and you obviously have some real feelings and great interest in this subject of electricity.
Yeah.
So that is quite fascinating.
Well, my dad and I sat down at the end of the millennium, and we thought about what the most significant discovery since, you know, of the last 100 years, well, he was in his 80s, and, it came down, the 20th century was an amazing year, because in 70 years we went from not being able to fly to going to the moon. But more significantly, at the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we discovered electricity, and electricity is the discovery of the millennium. It's as significant as fire.
Which you make a point of saying a number of times in this paper you wrote, and Peter did put together a paper on this subject where he outlines a lot of his beliefs and his strong feelings about electricity and its importance, and so you made that particular point several times. I noted that it's the most significant discovery.
It's important to repeat the basic idea, over and over again, whether you're writing about it or talking about it, because if you don't, define everything else you're saying in relationship to the basic thing you're thinking about, then you've always got to bring it back to the focus of what you're discussing, and that's what I'm going to try to do today in the interview.
It's interesting, the first line in your paper, you say that humans made an enormous blunder with the discovery of electricity.
Yeah, they really did.
Why don't you tell our listeners something about what did you mean by that? Why do you start your paper off that particular line? What is significant about this point?
Well, we're going to try to get to the bottom of it by the end of this interview, but basically the discovery of electricity is not compatible with our economics. In other words, the direction our economic system took electricity is not what needed to happen. I believe that electricity as a form of electromagnetic energy is utopian, and the way we've integrated it into our society and into a complicated sociological, economic, and ecological system has not been done appropriately.
And after some of this introductory information you've just been talking about what is in the opening paragraphs of your paper, you launch into a little bit of history about a gentleman by the name of Nicholas Tesla.
Nikolai Tesla.
Yeah, tell our listeners something about who is this gentleman and what part does he play in your story, and why is he important to you?
Well, he is one of the most amazing engineers and scientists who's ever lived. And so many people know so little about him, but I have spent hours and hours reading and studying about, where he was going and he understood robotics back before electricity was even invented. And Marconi's given credit for the radio, but he also invented the radio. But Tesla really developed the first two dynamos. He developed a dynamo that would make DC current for Edison, and he made a dynamo for Westinghouse.
He worked with Edison, right?
Well, actually, yeah, he worked for Edison, and Edison said that if Tesla could do what he did, that he'd make him a fortune. And then after Tesla did it, he said, "Oh, I was just joking." No, that's literally what Edison said.
That sounds like Thomas Edison.
You were taking me too seriously.
That I'm kind of chuckling because that does sound like Thomas Edison, what he would have done.
Well, and then he went to work for
Westinghouse,
right,
yes.
And he invented the AC dynamo. Alternating, there's two basic forms of electromagnetic current that we use. One is direct current, DC, and the other is alternating current, AC. And they're both necessary for setting up the kind of electrical grid we have now.
Yes, Edison was a DC man, isn't that what he was primarily?
Yeah, Edison. There were the electrical war. Once Tesla gave him these dynamos, there were the electric wars. AC was much more practical over long distances, whereas DC is what runs your computer. It's all it's all transformable.
If you've just tuned in, you're listening to Anything Goes, and our guest today is Peter Anger, a local artist here in mid-Missouri and also a member of the board of KOPN 89.5. And Peter is here today talking with us about a paper that he has written on the subject of electricity, which is obviously something that affects all of us very greatly now.
Yeah, we just take it so for granted.
Yeah, it is just a part of our lives. Tesla also had some interest in, and he was aware of ecological implications, I believe, of electricity.
He was very engaged.
He was an incredibly intelligent man. It's amazing how late 20th century his mind actually was, in a way. He was interested in everything and aware of everything. He was.
He wanted electricity to be utopian.
The way we create electricity, you say in your paper, and how it needs to be integrated into a very complex ecological system, needed to be done in accordance to Tesla's vision. And what was Tesla's vision? What did he imagine and believe that we should be doing?
It's funny, probably everybody knows what a Wi-Fi network is. You log on to your little Wi-Fi network. Well, what Tesla wanted to do was create an electrical grid that was Wi-Fi. That's why he developed the radio. It's possible to put electricity into the atmosphere at very high voltage and very low current and aperture, and then with a small antenna run any kind of electrical device. So that was one part of what he envisioned. So you wouldn't have this huge electrical grid. The other thing that's, in my opinion, that's been kept from the public is that the Earth is a natural motor or generator of electromagnetic energy. Anytime you sit down and watch a thunderstorm, that's true. With lightning in the discharge between the atmosphere and the ground, there's a tremendous amount of energy being generated by the Earth revolving in a magnetic field. It's a natural motor. The only thing it needs is the commutator. And what Tesla realized after developing the dynamo, a dynamo is just a motor that generates the electricity, and then a motor is just a device that takes the electricity and runs the motor. So his vision was to make these antennae that were connected to the ground and had a very huge, electrical transmitting device that both connected to the magnetic qualities and electromagnetic energies between the friction between the atmosphere and a magnetic field, and a special kind of grounding system. And he proved that it was quite possible to generate incredible amounts of electricity and then transform it and put it into the atmosphere so that all your electrical devices could just be run off of a small antenna.
Was anyone interested in his thoughts about this, his vision? Any corporate, what we would call today corporate type interests?
When Westinghouse, Edison had deep pockets, and Westinghouse didn't at that point, because all he was involved with was the generation of alternating current. He didn't have the structure. So he got into desperate straits, fighting the DC AC wars, with Edison. And so what did Tesla do? He had the patent on the Westinghouse, AC dynamo. Tesla gave him the patents, just gave it to him. I mean, that's where Tesla was, going with his ideas. So, I mean, those patents are just phenomenally important now for Westinghouse, and as well as a lot of other things. But suffice it to say that Tesla's vision was to integrate an electrical grid that was totally wireless. In other words, the same way that you run your radio and your Wi-Fi network, you'd also get your electricity. So you wouldn't need any kind of electrical grid. The other thing is that if you build these specialized antennas between the Earth and the atmosphere and transmit this electricity, it's pollution-free. By the use, most of our pollution and global warming is due to the burning of fossil fuels. And it's quite possible to do that without burning fossil fuels, based on what Tesla wanted to do as far as the generation of electricity. So when Westinghouse got into financial trouble because of the war between the DC and AC, which Tesla knew we needed both, he went to J.P. Morgan, and J.P. Morgan funded his research into making sure it could be done. So he built a small laboratory in New York at first and did it on a small scale. And then he went out to Colorado Springs.
Yes,
and he did it on a very large scale. And he also did a lot of other really important research that I don't know if I even feel comfortable talking about it, based on some of the things I see going on with some of his other knowledge and discoveries. But what I'm trying to do is get back to the crux of the problem with our global warming and why we're having so much trouble ecologically. Because the way we are generating electricity is at least 50% of the CO2 that we're putting in the atmosphere. And Tesla envisioned a way of doing that that was pollution-free, that worked in harmony with the planet. And we didn't do it. Because when he told J.P. Morgan that he was going to give away electricity for free and just charge a certain royalty on the electrical products to fund the generation systems. So that's the simple version of it.
How is he going to get these antennas, up? How would this work?
Well, he proved in Colorado Springs, and then he came back to New York to build the first really big one on Long Island to see how big, there were still things that he wasn't sure about, but basically what they were going to do is create a great big umbrella that would generate electrical Wi-Fi energy and start developing the electrical devices, to test the, one big umbrella, transforming. It's really a generating, transforming Wi-Fi electrical grid. That's the best way I can describe it.
Were there any other people doing what he was doing, scientists doing what he was doing that, other than maybe Edison understanding it, were there others that?
Well, Marconi.
Yeah, and they were
Marconi was real interested in it, and he basically took the early research and development that Tesla had done with the radio and claimed it for his own.
Yes.
There were a lot. You got to remember that at the turn of this, just before the turn of the century and after the 10 or 15 years before the turn of the century, and then up until World War I, there was a lot of very dynamic science and industrial thinking going on, because we were an agrarian society, being thrust with our discoveries. We were being thrust into, and in the beginnings of the industrial age.
What was the Earth's population at the time Tesla was doing all this work?
It was about 1 to 2 billion.
1 to 2 billion.
Yeah.
Yeah. By the way, which I believe that 1 billion, many scientists think that's the actual carrying capacity, I think is the term they use, would be the ideal population.
Yeah, I'd feel a lot more comfortable at 1 or 2 than 7.
Yeah, that is my understanding. That's the number that many scientists
But
think
a lot of what caused, the opportunity for population growth was electricity.
Obviously.
An internal combustion engine doesn't work very well without electricity. You got to have, that's what made spark plugs possible.
Yeah, it's anyone that is in the science field and had any schooling at all, of course, knows about Tesla. But yeah, it's amazing because his ideas were pretty incredible. I mean, it's incredible.
And there's a whole bunch of other stuff that is just buried way down there that's really pretty. It's
interesting that he doesn't have the familiarity as people like Edison, though, and who was also a businessman. And I've always been amazed that Tesla isn't one of those names that immediately come to everybody, to non-scientists, for instance, but everybody knows who Thomas Edison is.
Yeah, well, knowledge is a dangerous thing, and truth sometimes is even more dangerous.
Now, at the time of Tesla, though, he wasn't alone. Many historians and people in the public life and even scientists at that time believed that the future concept, the property, was communal. That was kind of a vision that many people shared at that time.
The whole, Marx and Engels, had a basic a communal idea. That's where the word communism comes from. But I come down much more on Tesla's point of view of utopianism. John Lennon was a utopian. Okay, that's the difference between Marx and Engels and John Lennon. John Lennon was a utopian, and Marx and Engels were communal. Whereas, I'm a Native American. I get what the Native American mentality was all about. When the Indians, when the Pilgrims wanted to trade beads for land, they were happy to take the beads because the concept of ownership of land was just totally alien to them. They were so utopian that, the idea of ownership of anything was just ridiculous to them. And that's the difference. Utopianism is about ownership of nothing. You're allowed to live here for a while, and if you treat everybody right, you live a happy life.
You say in your paper, I made a note of this, the real question we have to ask ourselves is the generation of energy a product for sale by the makers of it, or is it a birthright or legacy of our species? And then you go on to say that Tesla himself envisioned the naturally occurring phenomena of electric potential that can be generated from a naturally occurring relationship between our planet and atmosphere as communal, and are belonging to all of us. That is what Tesla believed.
Exactly, yeah, he was a utopian. But he didn't believe that, something as important as electricity should be controlled by anyone. It was communal. It belonged to the species of the people of the earth.
Well, the question now is, to follow up, he went out to Colorado Springs, did some more work.
Yeah, he did a lot of really, J.P. Morgan, he had a lot of things on. He didn't have just what he was doing with electricity on his plate, and I can't stress that enough. The discoveries that he made are still top secret in many communities.
So what happened after Colorado Springs?
Well, he came back from Colorado Springs after doing a lot of research, and he was going to set up, this big tower. It's like I said, we don't really have a name for it, but it was a Wi-Fi transforming electrical grid, in that the tower took in the static electrical energy and the potential electromagnetic difference that exists between the ground and the atmosphere. If you look at a thunderstorm, you know this to be true. But he had a system of grounding and an antenna that could draw the electricity in, transform it, and then convert it into a practical form of high energy radio electromagnetic energy that could be received by a small antenna on any device, just like what your Wi-Fi computer does with the signal, and convert it into a practical form of energy. Electromagnetic energy can be transformed into many different types. That was another thing that he was working on, were amazing different kinds of transformers. But the other thing that's really important here is that it's a naturally occurring phenomenon. The static electricity that occurs in a lightning storm is not practical for any of our material applications, but he had a way of drawing the potential different energy between our natural grounded earth and the atmosphere and the magnetic field that it spins in. And what he was going to do was create the first umbrella. Imagine Columbia with a big antenna that just gave everybody Wi-Fi. He was going to generate an electrical generating system that allowed an umbrella over Long Island, so that you didn't have to build telephone poles and all this other, stuff all the wires that we use. He just wanted to put the energy into an multiple umbrellas all over the planet, and let everyone have electricity for free. And the way he was going to pay for it was a royalty on the cost of the electrical products that you bought.
Okay. And he was aware. I remember that he was aware that this discovery of electricity and how humans were going to use it was going to be the thing, more than anything else, that radically transformed human life.
Oh, absolutely. Wouldn't you agree with what is? Can you tell me something more radical that transformed the 20th century than electricity?
No, it's almost impossible to think of anything.
Flight is a close second, and that's huge. But when you think about the importance of electricity, it's really pretty phenomenal, and it's a big. Tesla knew. He says in his biographical work all the time that if you use fossil fuels to do this, you're going to ruin the atmosphere.
Yeah, that's
and imagine
some foresight.
Imagine an automobile. Imagine this. Imagine an automobile without an internal combustion engine, just a big drive motor and an antenna going down the highway. We didn't even have to. He envisioned a world where we didn't even have to have very many internal combustion engines. We got caught in this resource greedy mentality. If you can run your car by drawing electrical current out of the air and run the motor in the car, you can make a very lightweight vehicle that will go wherever the electrical umbrella Wi-Fi grid is. It's a totally different way of. He envisioned automatons, automatic systems, robotic systems very early on that would both control the network and, allow you. He invented the first electrical, submarines. He some of the little boats and things were the first radio controlled devices. It was amazing what he accomplished.
Did Edison keep his eye on it in some way? It's hard to imagine
Edison was just Edison really didn't invent. He was just a ruthless business person, in my opinion. He claimed everything for himself.
But he had a large number of people working for him.
Yeah. He was
also assisting.
He was a great performer. He really understood where a lot of the technology was going, and in a lot of ways he directed the direction that it went.
It's just, it seems like he might have been aware of the implications of some of these things Tesla was working on, that it had some tremendous economic pluses too.
Edison, like I said, he was a really good business. It was all about he stole this movie that a French cinema photographer did, which he bet his whole fortune on the movie. Edison stole it and knocked it off and was charging for it, and Charles Fourier was depending on the sale and profits from the movie. He didn't just rip off scientists, he ripped off artists, and the Charles Fourier one is the one that, chaps me the most, is that, here's an artist who's doing incredible cinema photography and just totally rips them off.
And what about J.P. Morgan? What is his role after he had met with Tesla? Was he monitoring what Tesla was doing, and he realized the financial implications of it?
No, the problem is the economic mentality of the time. It's not utopian. J.P. Morgan was not a utopian, and he, when Tesla said said what he wanted to do and the vision he had for the distribution and generation of electricity, J.P. Morgan said, "We're not going to give electricity away." That was basically all he said, and then he cut him off, and he started discrediting him. And they made him to look made him to look like he was a fool.
And for our listeners who may not know who J.P. Morgan is, he was, at that time, I'm guessing he probably was the richest man in the world.
Hands down.
Yeah, hands down. So
if there was one person, all this talk about who the richest people are and who's controlling what, it was very clear in the 1900s who the richest man in the world was. It was J.P. Morgan, John Pierpont Morgan.
He was famous. He was famous. He had an incredible amount of power.
Yes, he did. And it was all out in the open. Some people call it the Gilded Age, but at least you knew what you were dealing with. It's so ambiguous.
Indeed.
It's so diverse now.
Yeah, he was a character in E.L. Doctorow's Ragtime, too. I believe he was left out of the movie they made from Doctorow's novel, which is a pretty terrible movie, but it's a novel I really loved when I read it back there in the mid-'70s. But J.P. Morgan was an important character in Doctorow's novel.
Well, the funny thing about especially rich and powerful people is that they touch and affect so many lives.
Indeed.
It's
especially people like Morgan.
Yeah.
So to follow up on Tesla, what happened to his life?
Well,
what happened as he got older and his vision didn't come to pass? What happened? Tell us something about Tesla.
Well, he continued
later life.
He continued to do he went from being the toast of the town to, made out to look like the the fool of the age, and that's why, you know, he hasn't been he was not, he was a utopian. Okay, he was a utopian, and that went very contrary to what Marx and Engels were talking about, and it goes very contrary to where J.P. Morgan and Edison, you know, were dictating what they wanted to do. And then, you know, you had this guy named Henry Ford, who just invented the internal combustion engine, and his wife really liked the electric car a lot more. So, you know, those three industrialists, you know, determined the direction that the country went. And, you know, Henry Ford said that, you know, make the best product possible at the best price possible, paying the best wages possible. And we've also lost that in this beginning of our millennium. You know, I mean, Henry Ford knew that, you know, if you didn't pay people well enough to buy your car, they wouldn't be able to buy it. And it's all about cheaper and cheaper stuff.
That was brilliance on his part. That assembly line mind.
Well, the industrialists of the 20th century are gone. It's all about maximizing profit. And if you talk to a lot of these CEOs, they're just going, why do we have to make a profit all the time? I don't understand why we have to keep outdoing ourselves from quarter to quarter. It's just not making sense. And at a certain point, you go about it. You've cut and done about as much as you can, and you can't go any further. But let's get back on track. The point here is that electricity is the fundamental building block of our technology. In other words, it's as significant to a modern age as fire. And the thing that the basic reason we're having such an ecological problem is because we have internal combustion engines, which was not a part of Tesla's vision, and we don't have an electrical grid that is being generated in an ecologically sound manner. And Tesla knew that. I mean, he warned all these industrialists, if you go down this path, you know, it leads to ecological ruin. You know, it's kind of like, you know, imagine, you know, fire burning up the earth. I mean, that's kind of like what electricity is like if you don't do it right. And this is what I've been meditating on since my father's death and the discussion we had about how significant it was. And I just wanted to do this interview to kind of express, you know, I'm 57 now and I'm not afraid anymore. So I'm kind of expressing some of the ideas that my dad and I talked about over the years.
You're listening to KOP in Columbia. This is Anything Goes, and our guest today is Peter Anger, if you just tuned in. And Peter is a local artist here in mid-Missouri. You may have seen some of his fabulous photos if you're out and about from time to time. He's also a KOPN board member.
Yeah, I love KOP.
Oh, yes.
You know, it's the voice of reason in a sea of insanity.
And we're talking about electricity, a paper that Peter has written, and probably the hero of the piece is Tesla, a visionary of the early 20th century, someone who had an association with famous people like Thomas Edison and J.P. Morgan, Westinghouse, a very brilliant person who we've been talking about this, and we talked about this in the first half hour, and it's just amazing that many Americans, they may not even know his name, but he's probably one of the most important scientific figures, cultural figures, if you get right down to it, in the 20th century.
Well, he was also an engineer. Let's not forget that, you know, science is one thing, but, you know, putting it to practical use is engineering. And he not only understood the incredible scientific concepts, he also understood how to he apparently had visions of exactly what needed to be built. I mean, it's like he had a photographic mind for what needed to be built to do a specific task, both electronically and physically. I mean, these dynamos that generate electricity are something, if you've ever seen one.
Oh, yes, I have. Yes, I'm very acquainted with them. Well, you say, actually, you quote one of my heroes, Carl Sagan, the late great scientist and teacher Carl Sagan.
He was amazing.
Yes, you said that Carl Sagan implied in many of his works of fiction that we are a violent species.
Yes, we are.
And you mentioned that our world is not unlike elementary school, which is, I think, something that many of us picked up on at some point. There is some truth.
Identify with that.
Okay, and what does this particular subject have to do with our subject of electricity and what Tesla did, and why is it of interest to you, the man's nature, basically violent or warlike nature?
Well, let's not forget that warfare is very profitable.
Indeed.
Eisenhower reminded us of that in his farewell speech, and what we're dealing with now on planetary scale.
Now, several wars that are going to make someone something like $10 trillion before it's all over.
Right.
It's very profitable.
It's the golden triangle, and it's incredibly profitable, and nationalism is ridiculous, and the whole idea that, you know, we're so connected on the internet, but nationalism still exists, and we still have to fight wars with other countries, and terrorism is, we're just on the wrong path. And the problem is that we're being exploited by a bunch of very wealthy people who, you know, want to just be as rich as they possibly can at everybody else's expense.
Indeed.
And they're the bullies. They're the grown-up bullies.
Okay, that is your tie-in from the schoolyard.
They're the grown-up bullies who run the planet and make us step to and in line to the corporate message.
You have a term you use in your paper called creative destruction.
Oh, yeah.
Tell me about creative destruction and where that came from, and how this ties in with the possibility of someday the human race implementing Tesla's vision of this utopian world.
Well, it can be integrated anytime we want to do it. The funny thing is there's even better ways of doing it now. We're just not doing it. Creative destruction is a term that Joseph Schumpeter came up with. He's probably one of my favorite economists, and he coined this term creative destruction after as we were coming. I think he came up with it in around 1946, and it's fundamental to the nature of capitalism in that capitalism is always favoring the destruction of the old ways of doing things in favor of more complex and simple ways of things that need to be done. You know, the computer is a beautiful example. The computer is like a big, huge black hole, and it has destroyed so many ways that the industrial world used to do things. I mean, we're going into the information age, and the computer is a lovely example of how, you know, I mean, we've gone from desktop computers in 20 years to cell phones that are incredibly powerful. That's creative destruction. The basic goal and fundamental principle in the universe, which I've written a lot about is emergence. Emergence says that what we are doing as a basic principle in the universe is that things are always being destroyed in favor of more complex and simple ways of doing things. And Joseph Schumpeter basically led me into this idea of emergence. But emergence and creative destruction are very comparable. But the thing that I'm trying to get a point across as an economist in a capitalist system is that capitalism is always destroying the old ways of doing things in favor of simpler and more complex ways of doing things that usually save money.
Yes. And you bring up, I was looking at your paper here, you talk quite a bit about the schoolyard bully, of course, and the obsession. Economics is tied in with power and the love of power and the desire for power.
Sure. And that, again, that's both a very complicated and sociological and class issue. What I'm trying to do with this paper is, electricity is the central part, of the central focus of the paper, but there's like this big orbital circle sphere around it that ties in, I'm going to try to tie it into, all of the different psychological and sociological and class related issues. And wealthy people grow up in a very different rarefied environment than other people. I heard an interesting interview on NPR the other day that, just your name in the class that you grow up in, you very rarely move anywhere hardly out of that class, no matter, and a lot of it, a bunch of sociologists did a study with, your name is so important to the class you're born into. So that's just amazing. But what the point I'm making is that, the very wealthy and very wealthy people grow up very separate from and very differently than working class people, and even scientists and academics. They're for the most part, they're pretty isolated unless they choose to interact with people like Tesla and Edison. So suffice it to say that, it's my opinion that, the upper classes grow up not only in a rare environment, but a very different mindset than, a lot of other people.
Obviously.
It's simple. But there's also this biological propensity for power, and power is a very especially power over other people, is a very intoxicating thing. That's probably the most powerful drug there is.
Well, and this brings me to, we're getting down to about our last 10 minutes or so. So this convergence that we were talking about, so what do you envision we do as a species to take the ideas of these great utopian thinkers like Tesla and turn them into something concrete now in this world we live in now? Your thoughts on what is needed? How do we rise above this economic way of thinking, and the economics being the sole reason why it seems to be done? Just your thoughts on a still someday possible utopian future. How do we take Tesla's ideas and turn them into something concrete, reality?
Well, let me tell you a little joke that my father used to love to say as an animal behaviorist. There's a story, and it's told a number of different ways, but I'll tell it with the frog and the scorpion. The scorpion is at the edge of a great big river, and he wants to get across it. And he sees a frog, and he goes over to the frog, and he says to the frog, "Why don't you swim me across the river?" The frog says, "No, I can't do that. I know who you are. You're a scorpion. If I take you across the river, you'll sting me and we'll die." And Scorpion says, "Oh, come on." And he puts up a real persuasive argument. So the frog finally relents, and they're swimming across this great river. And as they're in the middle of it, the scorpion stings them. And the frog goes, "Why did you do that? Why did you do that? Now we're both going to die." And he goes, "I can't help it. It's my nature." So that's what we're dealing with here. That was the metaphor my father left me with. And I am not particularly optimistic about our future at this point. I think a lot of it has to do with our animal behavior. and our basic nature, what my father called our rat brains. You know, our brains are very evolved, but at the central base of it is a rat brain, a mammalian rat brain, and that's what he was looking at. And we've talked about that a lot, and that's probably a subject for another discussion. But I'm not particularly optimistic. The creative destruction has the roots of capitalism's own destruction. And until capitalism destroys itself, I don't think anything will emerge.
Who now is aware of Tesla's dreams, his umbrella, as you called it? Is there anyone now? Engineers?
There's a couple. They actually built some small ones. You know, they built some small ones around the country. You could, if you do, you know, the truth is out there if you want to look for it. Yeah. I haven't been to any one of them because I was convinced a long time ago that, you know, he knew what he was. The guy we needed, who was pretty much ignored for the last 30 years of his life, you know, because it was in an economic direction that the capitalists wanted to go. He was a utopian. You know, I mean, they basically did the same thing to him that, you know, we did to the Indians.
Well, you know. What happened to him, by the way? The last of Tesla's life.
He lived in a motel room in New York for the last 20, 30 years of his life, alone. He never married, never had he was like the ultimate geek. You know, he never married. He was rather superstitious. You know, he was connected to a center in a different way that people just don't comprehend.
Yes, because I don't recall even having read anything about how he ended his life. So even
he died alone in his apartment. I think it was in. I don't remember the exact date, but it was in the early 50s.
Okay, that I was getting ready to ask about what. Because he seems like such a character out of the Edison and J.P. Morgan years, which is in the early years of the 20th century. It's hard to imagine that he lived that long.
He was the young gene. He was the young super geek. I mean, Edison and Westinghouse and J.P. Morgan were old guys at that point.
Yes,
you know, Tesla was only in maybe his early 30s when he did his most important work, relationship to electricity. So,
but an incredible legacy.
Oh yeah,
obviously.
No, I mean the rabbit hole goes a lot deeper.
I'm rather amazed that the new series, the new Cosmos, they've been dredging up a number of very great people that are not really recognized in the way they should be. And so far, I haven't seen Tesla's name, but they've done a great job about giving credit to people like Tesla and from the scientific world that should be more recognizable now, that deserve recognition.
You know, I mean, truth is stranger than fiction, and you know, the winners of the economic game have always written the history. So
it seems to work that way, doesn't it, Peter?
There's a consistent trend to it over the centuries. So, but I don't know if we're capable of changing our ways. I just don't know.
Before I let you go, you mentioned in your paper a recent movie, Cloud Atlas.
Yeah, Cloud Atlas is a wonderful movie.
Tell our listeners something about why did you mention that particular movie in
because I think
reference to what we're talking about?
I think it's one of the best movies that's been. I remember when Blade Runner came out. Everybody knows Blade Runner.
Oh yes, everyone.
You know, and Blade Runner was written by Philip K. Dick. The original name of the book was Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? But they changed it to Blade Runner, and that came out in the early 80s. And for years, that was my favorite science fiction movie. But what the makers of The Matrix have done with Cloud Atlas is just an incredible movie. And you know, my degree is in cinema and photography, and I've watched a lot of movies, but Cloud Atlas is the best major film that's been done since Blade Runner. It gets what I'm talking about across. Now, it can be a depressing, unpleasant movie, But it's a good, I don't know exactly how it's all going to fold, but these two directors who did The Matrix and now Cloud Atlas is just an amazing story.
I don't think it did very well at the box office, did it? Or am I wrong?
It totally,
Yeah, I thought it
bottomed
was a
out.
flop. Yeah, I thought it was a
all the
flop.
critics said it was just a horrible, depressing movie and too complicated. It's too complicated. I don't understand the timeline. But it had great acting in it. Tom Hanks is in it, and Halle Berry, and a lot of really great actors.
That's right. Yeah, a number of.
And you have to
actors.
watch it half a dozen times to get what they're talking about. You can get the basics in the first, but that's what a good movie is all about. Is it's all these wonderful details that go through the movie. So.
Well, Peter, we're kind of going to have to bring this to a close here in about 5 minutes or so. Can you is there anything you want to say at this time you spent putting all this story together about Tesla and why his utopian vision did not happen and what its implications are for us now? What are your thoughts on how would you like to wrap this up?
Again, both my father looked at animal behavior, for the 80 years, 60 years that he lived. And, the problems we're having ecologically now are directly related to our evolution ecologically and the ways our brains have developed over the millennium. And whether or not it's very changeable is not clear. We need, we really need to, kind of really examine, our opportunities within the current, programming or mindset that we have biologically. And that's been a big part of my life, But what I'm trying to do here is say, what got us into trouble ecologically and biologically as far as population is electricity. Electricity is kind of like a doorway to the universe. Without electricity, we wouldn't have gone to the moon. It's a doorway off the planet, but we're not going to get off the planet until we have the right mindset. And until we have the right mindset, we're on a highway to our own self-destruction. That's unfortunately that's what I've been looking at and feeling and seeing. And I'm getting towards I'm short in the war now. I didn't used to be short in the war, and I've had a great time as a professional photographer. But the reason I've gotten involved with KOPN is because it's time for some of these things to be talked about. Einstein said, in the middle of difficulty lies opportunity, and we're running into some really difficult times, both as a species and ecologically. I think we're on the verge of a mass extinction, personally.
And you are not alone. If you listen to some of our great scientists out there, especially in the realm of things like paleontology and geology and biology, you're not alone. There are many people who do think that we are right now in the midst of the sixth of the great
I
mass
listened
extinction.
to one of your shows where you talked about that. It was really a wonderful show too. I have no idea how this is all going to go down. I'm just saying that electricity and the way we're generating it is just being done wrong.
Well. And with that, Peter Anger, I think we're about out of time, and thank you so much for being here with me today.
Pleasure.
And it was just absolutely fabulous listening to a little bit about the life of this very great man, Tesla, and your thoughts about how we tie his life and vision of a future utopia into what's going on now.
Well, great discoveries have a way of changing things.
They do indeed. With that, Peter Anger, thank you so much for being here with me today, sir.
You bet. Well, I think